All right, we are live. We will give it a few seconds for folks to jump in here. We will get going here shortly, and I will kick off with intros because folks are probably familiar with me. So if they miss it, it's not a big deal. My name is Mitch Stein. I'm the CEO and co-founder at Pond. We host these webinars for the nonprofit audience every week, every Thursday here at noon Eastern, 9 Pacific. We get amazing speakers like the ones we have today to talk about really pressing issues in the nonprofit space. You also get $50 credit if you're a Pond member just for attending these sessions and taking the time to invest in yourself. So please fill out the survey at the end of our session. We appreciate it. You can use those credits on Pond, which is a one-stop shop for nonprofit leaders to discover all the solutions that you need to run your organization. If you have questions, obviously we're here at joinpond.com. Would love to chat with you about it. But without further delay, we definitely want to get over to the stars of the show here, and I'll just kick around to this group for introductions. If you don't mind sharing, who you are, what you're up to these days, and a few layers of your identity that are most important to you. And I will hand it over to Adam, given you're right next to me.
Thanks, Mitch. My name's Adam Garoni. I'm the CEO of Starlight Children's Foundation. Previous to that, and what I'm sort of most known for in the not-for-profit space was I was the co-founder of Movember and the CEO of the Movember Foundation for 15 odd years. Layers to me are father of two young kids. We're actually at Disneyland yesterday, so that put the father role to test for sure. And the other thing for me is like I've lived a life and a career of service.
Awesome. Amy, do you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Amy Sample Ward. I use they, them. I'm the CEO of N10, which is a nonprofit organization focused on making sure that every mission and every movement can be successful with a strategic and equitable use of technology. So I have lots of love for the conversation we're about to have today, for sure, and have the immense privilege of getting to say I wrote a book with Afua Bruce, which really trumps anything else. Pretty incredible opportunity. Layers of identity. Oh my gosh. I hope we're here all day. There's a lot to talk about, gosh. But I guess going from what Adam said, parent, having a kid start school in the pandemic has been not what I anticipated the transition to school to be. So if anyone wants to talk about generalized anxiety, let me know. Definitely struggle with that. And I think a big part of identity in these conversations to me is who has the power and privilege to share identities and when. And we can talk about that more for sure. Jason, awesome. You're the next box on my screen.
All right. So my name's Jason Shim, and I'm a nonprofit technologist, and I've spent my career in the nonprofit sector at the intersection of nonprofits, youth, and technology. And so I'm currently working with a national nonprofit that helps youth living in low-income communities to graduate from high school and reach their full potential, and have led various innovation projects over the years to help the organization grow and develop its capacity. I'm also the co-author of the book, Bitcoin and the Future of Fundraising. And with regards to layers of identity, my parents had immigrated to Canada, and navigating the systems and bureaucracies was challenging, and even more so when observing them over the years, trying to do so on behalf of someone else. So as I was growing up, that was something that really stuck with me in terms of what I observed. That experience was moving to a new country, not knowing the language, having to figure all that out and do so, for the benefit of someone else. So that's one layer of my identity, is as a child of immigrants and helping. That's really instilled a sense of wanting to help youth in my own life and in the world to access the resources and what they need to succeed and thrive. And an additional layer on top of that is also as a recent parent myself, and thinking really deeply about those things, and how do you build a better world for the little ones? Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jason. And Afua.
Thanks. Happy to round out the introductions here. My name is Afua Bruce. Really happy just to be a part of this group and this discussion today. I co-wrote the book, The Change That Comes Next. The Tech That Comes Next actually is the title, but it talks about change that's needed with Amy Sample Ward, and that is so much fun. It's been wonderful to collaborate with Amy. A part of my identity to share today, I think it's just that I'm the child of Ghanaian immigrants and super proud of my Ghanaian heritage.
Amazing. Well, this is a real honor to be here with you all. I encourage everyone, some other folks have, please jump in the chat, ask any questions you have. We'll also have this conversation in our podcast feed and in a summary write-up. So we'll have lots of great takeaways for everybody, and the video will be available afterwards to review. Without further delay, we're here today to talk about nonprofit innovation. And it can be a bit of a buzzword, and it can mean a lot of different things to different people. I would love to just start off to lay the groundwork. Like, what does innovation mean for a nonprofit organization? And is that even always a good thing? Like, we always assume that's forward progress, but what does innovation really mean to you? And I know everyone will have an answer to this, but Amy, why don't you kick it off? I know you spent a lot of time thinking and discussing this with your recent book.
Yeah, actually, a number of years ago, I did keynotes all around the world talking about how everything that people know about innovation is wrong. So I have some feelings, but I think the crux of my feelings is that we have in many things and in many topics gotten our view shifted by like flashy, shiny corporate talk, and innovation through that has been warped into this idea that it's like something really exclusive that only some people get to do or have access to. It's something really expensive. So again, only some people can do it. And it's something that you need to like have the right words and the right jargon and know the right people, right? Like only some elements can even make innovation. And that is the thing that is wrong, right? That is not what innovation is, especially when we want to talk about technology. I mean, even tech companies are not innovating in that definition, right? It's like one tiny change. Whoa, now everything's, different, right? So I think what I would love as a kind of working definition to start with and layer on everyone else's ideas is that innovation is really not accepting that the only way you're doing it now is the only way you can do it now, right? Knowing that maybe there's a better way for this process to work. Maybe there's a step that you could change and it makes it easier for your participants to be in that program, right? Finding those small changes like every single day in every single department that every single staff person has access to suggest or discover or solve, that's innovation, because what it's doing is having kind of an unknown, like wide open impact when you make that one change, right? It could ripple out to lots of other changes or time saved that now you can do, something else with.
Yeah, and Afua, I'd love to hear from you. Like Amy said, it really is really within reach, and yet nonprofits in particular have the stigma of not being innovative, or that it is out of reach for them. Why is there that disconnect, do you think, in the sector?
Yeah, and thank you for this question, because you are right that sometimes people have a perception of the nonprofit sector of not being innovative. And I think for those of us who have spent any amount of time in a nonprofit, looking at budgets that never seem like they are enough, dealing with resource constraints, dealing with staffing constraints, dealing with changing or unexpected environments, in partnering with the communities and serving clients and serving humans, we would know that you have to be innovative in the nonprofit world in order to execute on the mission. The environments are changing so frequently. And so when I think of innovation, I really think about it in the terms of really thinking about just finding a new approach to a problem that matters. And so that can be something that requires a new technical solution or a new product creation, or it could be changing an internal system inside your organization. I think the innovation of process to get things done really matters, because it can affect the way that you interact with your communities, the way you serve your communities, and the way you deliver impact to the communities you serve. And so for people who have this perception of nonprofits not being innovative, I would say spend some time with organizations in having to constantly figure out how to deliver in a constantly changing and evolving environment. And you'll quickly learn what it means to be innovative in real time.
Yeah, and Jason, what do you think the reason that there is that resistance to, even these small changes that Amy and Afua have mentioned? Sometimes those are still really hard to get, especially if you're at an older organization or staff that's been around for a long time. Where have you seen that kind of resistance to change show up, and what do you think are the best antidotes to that resistance?
Yeah, I think that when thinking about innovation, sometimes it can be thought of in really like large, grandiose terms. And I think that, sometimes when we hear about innovation, the ones that make the headlines are like, the big epic changes with the big, huge results. But I think sometimes when you're trying to pitch innovation internally to a team, if that's what people have in their head in terms of, okay, that's going to be innovation, it feels like a really massive undertaking, and that it's going to disrupt everything. Everyone's, roles and responsibilities and jobs are, in question. But I think, part of it is that change management process where, trying to make innovation accessible, to the earlier points that were mentioned. And, Afua also mentioned, which I'll pick up on, the innovation process itself, I think, is not necessarily well understood or defined as a convention, that, it's not just about the innovation itself, it's also about the process to get there. And one equation that I like to share with folks is, that the status quo is, an equation that would be like, 1 to the power of 365. But, think about it in 1% gains. So like 1.01 to the power of 365 multiplies to about 37 times over the course of a year. And so it becomes a lot more accessible when, you're able to break it down in terms for people to, simply think about, hey, what would make our day, our lives, our organization just 1% better every day? And suddenly you take it from this massive, conception of innovation to one that, almost anyone can pick up on. It's like, yeah, what would make my life 1% better right now? If I could automate this thing that I spend 20 minutes every day doing, yes, let's start with those kind of small things, build the space and the conversations around it for people to feel comfortable engaging in innovation and creating that psychological safety as well.
Yeah, that incrementalism seems really important to bring others along with you. And Adam, I know that you must get the question pretty much constantly from people, which is, oh, we need to be like Movember. Like, you just created this great thing, and like we just need to innovate like Movember. How do we do that? I'd love to hear, after hearing that, I'm sure hundreds or thousands of times, how do you respond to that today?
Yeah, I mean, I do get asked that all the time. We need a Movember, and it's like, are you sure? Because it's wasted energy to be thinking about a concept like that. I mean, we were having beers on a Sunday afternoon and weren't in the charity space. And you look at the Ice Bucket Challenge as well. There were some guys that were outside of the not-for-profit industry, passionate about ALS. They came up with that idea, and there's only a handful of those ideas, and you waste time thinking about that. And certainly we had this great concept, and through necessity with Movember, we built a fundraising platform because there wasn't one around back in 2004. And we just, I had a career prior to that in technology and the merge of mobile and web technologies. So we just looked at what was being done in the real world and then just replicated that through downloadable forms on the website. But I agree with Jason. I say to my team at Starlight all the time, if we've got, I think innovation is really just a different word for problem solving and how you go about solving problems. And you put in place systems, and then for the most part, it's about how can we tell our story 1% better? How can we make the experience when we get to starlight.org 1% better? How can we increase the conversion rate of the people starting a donation form or whatever it is by 1%. How can we increase the amount that they're donating by 1%? So that doesn't sound like anything spectacular, but when you focus on that, the cumulative effect of that over time, as Jason mentioned, is profound. And at Starlight, at Movember, there was a lot of innovation that we did around fundraising at the time, which is commonplace now. But at Starlight, a lot of our innovation is around our programs. So we've got a virtual reality program, and I love this program because instead of a child being sedated or put under to have a dressing on a burn change, which can be highly traumatic, they get immersed in virtual reality and explore an underwater world or a jungle while the clinician changes the dressing or cleans a chemo port. So you're saving a child from being administered drugs. They have fun and the procedure's done because the technology is so immersive. So a lot of what we focus on at Starlight is how do we problem solve using technology to make the experience of children in the hospital so much better.
I just want to, thanks for inviting me, Mitch, to listen and learn from all these other people. But I'm hearing Adam and Jason and Afua, and so much of what you're talking about, totally agree with that. +5, +100, plus whatever. But I think the disconnect for me is that I talk to nonprofit staff so often who are not prepared for a conversation of how do we make this 1% better, or how do we improve this process because we have to do this process every day, because so much of the work, kind of back to what Afua said, limited staff, limited time, limited budget, incredible need, constantly increasing need on the mission, right? It's so fragmented. And staff often, I've talked to some, run workshops, and there'll be multiple people from an organization. And that is the moment they realize, oh, you also use that report? I thought I was the only one that used that report. So I never cared to make it any better because I didn't even know anyone else looked at it, right? Or I've been entering this data by hand, and now I know this other team has some tool to enter the data. What? Why have I been doing this? So I wonder if you all have experience or can solve this for the entire sector, but how do we change our conversations around innovation, or even just tech projects in general, to get at before you can have a technical solution or a process change or whatever else, you actually just need to know what your colleagues are doing and what they need to do and where their sticking points are, because so much of the especially process innovation I've seen in the sector has been when two staff or two departments realize they're oh, the rub is we're both having to do this thing. Now let's make it better, because I could have just suffered silently over here, right? But now that I know there's another team or another person that's trying to do this with me, there's a little bit more motivation to find what that innovation can be. Have other folks felt that? Fine, if I'm alone, that's fine.
Between Movember and Starlight, I consulted in the sector, and a lot of it was around sort of innovation and process change, and it can be really frustrating in some organization. And I think it comes back to the leadership of the organization, and not-for-profits should be more interested in innovation because the resources are so limited that if you can make a process change and make something a little bit more efficient and free up half of someone's time in the process of doing that, the opportunity for them then to focus on something more meaningful than just manually entering data every day, because that's the way it's always been done, can have a profound effect. But unless a truly innovative culture is driven from the top down, you can have the most innovative, amazing people that are coming into the organization wanting change, but unless it's supported at a leadership level, it's not going to get very, very far. So a lot of this is around leadership, creating a culture of innovation and allowing people to do just that. And with that comes, things that are just not going to work. And I always tell my team, it's let's celebrate the stuff that doesn't work, but also celebrate the stuff that doesn't, because you learn from that. And that's really important in creating this sort of safe innovation culture. But obviously, you want to minimize the downside of that and recognize it as early as possible.
And I'd like to just pick up quickly on what Adam just pointed out of celebrating what doesn't work. And I think it's really important for organizations to realize that you can say no to things. You can say no to existing processes, to processes that seem, or to projects or to initiatives that seemed like really great ideas. And then once you get in it, it doesn't work. It's okay to say no to that. And so I think that's something that, especially within the nonprofit space, although I think we see it often in government and in corporations all the time, people forget that they, as individuals and as organizations, do have the power to say no to things. And so I think that's something that's really important to remember and to create space for innovation. I think also, when we talk about building this culture of innovation, one of the things that we touch on in the book is that although there are multiple roles and everyone has a responsibility. And so I think that, yes, it's important for the leadership of nonprofits to build a culture internally, but also thinking about what we could ask of funders to do and to support, to allow for some space and time to think about innovation, or what from a policy perspective can be done to think about what different innovations can happen inside the issue area that you're dealing with or that relate to your organization as well. And so even as we think about the leadership of nonprofits, building that culture of innovation, also think about what we can ask of people who have other roles, or if you're in a different role, what you can sort of push on to also encourage this culture of innovation.
I think picking up on the thread of building a culture of innovation as well, that's, building that sense of safety, that folks feel comfortable sharing what their real challenges are. Because I think that sometimes when you have these first layer conversations about innovation, that it can sometimes be very mechanical, where it's like, okay, let's do this thing. But then when you dig a little bit deeper, it's like, okay, but what's the real problem? Or what are the real challenges? And that necessitates sometimes a deeper level of vulnerability among teams that isn't necessarily tech specific or tool specific, but like it's more of a people process that's necessary. That if you want people to be able to collaborate well and share what their challenges are so they can help one another, I've found that being able to focus on building the team and the teams to gel together over time can be really helpful for facilitating innovation and innovative processes.
Yeah, and one thing I was going to throw out that I come across all the time is just there's some shame in sharing that either like you do something that you're not sure if it's right, or you don't want to look dumb, or like, is anyone else having this problem? And I think that, obviously a culture of safety helps with that. But Amy, how can you proactively help people overcome the shame? Because I think, you mentioned hosting workshops where people end up sharing that they were doing something wrong or that they failed. Yeah. Like, what is it that flips the switch for people that makes them comfortable sharing and getting over that?
Yeah, such a good question. And Jason, I appreciate you naming like how much of this is a person to person thing versus like technology specific. But, like just as the general invitation for all of us as evolving imperfect human beings, that like shame is not ours. You don't have to hold it. Just like put it down, walk away. You don't need that shame. But, I've experienced even in N10 when I first joined, it isn't that there was an intentional culture of like, we don't want people to share, but it was an organization that had a lot of staff who'd never been in organizations where they were allowed to share or be the staff person who had the idea. And, so it wasn't a matter of me saying, and now your ideas should happen. Like, people didn't have the muscle memory. They had never practiced doing it before. Right. And so it now, all these years later, is not something that we need anymore. And so to think of it, it feels like so awkward and mismatched to the organizational culture today. But back then, what was really helpful was to create literally like a doc template. This is how you present an idea. Make sure you have like a quick recap. Who is it helping, right? Like, what's the problem you're solving? Just walked people through it and then said, we expect everyone on the team to have some idea that you're sharing regularly, you know, so that we've kind of flipped Lindsay's comment, like flipped the requirement into not do these things the way you always do them, but hey, we really welcome and want and expect to hear new ideas from you. And having the template made it so that someone who's never presented an idea before, their idea looks exactly the same as someone who's really used to presenting those ideas. You know, it kind of changed that power differential. And so many of those ideas really did move forward. And what was so great is in the end, it wasn't like, oh, that was, you know, Tom's idea. No one remembered whose idea it was, right? Because it became everyone's idea and everyone got to work on it together, which is huge for change management and adoption, right? That like it didn't remain Tom's idea that we all had to do, right? It like really became the team's idea. And over time, people built up that muscle memory, and we didn't need that template anymore, but it was such a helpful tool. And so like free and easy, right? It was just a document template we like put in the shared drive. So finding something like that, even if it's not a template for sharing ideas, but finding a mechanism that's accessible to everyone and supports everyone having ideas is a really easy first step, I think.
Amy, I love that idea of having a template or a mechanism, because it just makes it easy and it levels access and it sort of levels the playing field. You describing your situation and 10 reminded me of a time I took over a team, and a month in I asked someone, you know, someone had collected information and presented a report. And I said, okay, so what are your recommendations? And she just sort of looked at me and said, excuse me? And I was like, you got all this information. What are your recommendations? She'd been on that team, I think, for 4 years. And she just responded, no one's ever asked me for what I thought before. Like, okay, I'm going to do this a little differently from now on. And let's build that muscle. But another reason why I like the template idea is because we have to recognize that, you know, from a power perspective, who is allowed to come up with ideas that don't work and who isn't. And for myself, for example, being a Black woman, if I'm in a predominantly white space, it is really hard for me in most spaces to come up with and present an idea that might not work. And so things like templates, things that you can do to really create processes and systems that provide care and do reinforce that culture are incredibly important in order to make sure that everyone on your teams can actually participate in a culture of innovation.
Yeah, and something both Afu and Amy talked about, which is that power dynamic and mechanism. We even saw this recently. We're working with a consultant to help us with like reframing messaging and taglines. And we gave them a bunch of reference material. And then when we had our first discussion about it, they were kind of following the same framework we'd already laid out. And it felt like I had to reassure them like 5 times, like, no, we don't care about that at all. Like they're so worried about offending or don't know what they can say or what they should talk about. And I think that exists in every team dynamic where someone's worried. And I love the point Amy made about it not being Tom's idea. I've seen this in so many different settings where then you end up pitting people against each other. It's like Tom's idea versus Michelle's. Which one are we going to prioritize versus just the ideas themselves? So those are great suggestions. Adam, I'd love to hear from you because you mentioned the virtual reality concept around programming. And I know your team focuses a lot on this space to create and come up with these creative ideas. How did you establish that? Was it a framework? Like, was there a specific time every week where you visited new ideas? Or what are some of the practices that you leverage to foster creative culture at your organization?
Yeah, one of our values is around innovation. So it's there's not a set time. We try to weave it into everything that we do, and some of it's structured, and then I really like unstructured thought process as well. So we've got one of our channels in Teams is just a channel where you can throw up anything that you see that might be good or bad or different, and how it's relevant then to potentially something that we do. And, you know, just throwing up, you know, something we see from St. Jude's or something like that, and opening up a conversation around what was good about it, what was, you know, different, and how that could apply to us. So for me, it's not set sessions per se, although when there is a specific problem, one of the first things I really encourage myself to do, and also the team, is truly identifying the problem before you jump to solving it. because it's in that process that will define where you go. So another example of one of our programs is we totally reinvented hospital gowns for kids a few years ago. So it's a double wrap around, it's a pajama-like material, does it from the side, not the back. It's got pockets for the largest size. And then we put like Star Wars and princesses and Frozen characters on it. So it totally transforms that moment for kids, which is one of the most stressful when they take off their clothes and put on a hospital gown. Then there was another problem with when you do that, you're typically waiting for 10 to sort of 30 minutes before the child goes into some sort of procedure. Again, highly stressful for the child and the family during that wait. So it's like, okay, how could we create something to fill that moment? So what we did with our hospital gowns now is each one's got a QR code. So the child can take their phone or their parent's phone, scan the QR code, goes to a web page where whatever that character is on the gown, so Woody from Pixar comes to life with a special message relevant to sort of that highly stressed situation. So that was a specific sort of problem that we sort of identified and then had working groups around that. You know, we spoke to families, we spoke to our clinicians in the hospitals to get feedback, and then came up with that solution. But outside of those specific sort of, yeah, we've got a problem here, and that's a great sort of problem to be able to solve. But there's other stuff where we get a feed from our warehouse, which is manually entered, you know, on all our inventory. That's manually entered into Salesforce. It's like, all right, how can we automate that so that we can free up that person's time to be working on something of higher value? So sort of those behind the scenes innovation, far less sort of potentially interesting because you know, it'll end up with some sort of integration, but just as important because it's going to free up that person who has, you know, amazing potential to work on something else.
Adam, it's so important that you name the focus groups and talking to the families. And also, just as an aside, our kiddo had a surgery during the pandemic, and I was like, listening to you talk, I was like, oh my gosh, those like gym jams in the hospital would have been a game changer. Bring those to Portland. And hopefully we don't need any more surgeries. So also maybe we don't need them, but for other kiddos. But it's so important because I think what I was saying earlier about individual staff in different teams or within the organization feeling a bit disjointed from each other and not really knowing, you know, what other folks are working on. And especially that feeling of like, if it's just me, I'm not going to complain about this report. I'm just going to keep using it. Like, whatever, it's not a big deal until you realize, oh, other people also need this report. It also happens in the community, especially organizations who are loved by the community that is around their mission, because folks don't want to feel like they're complaining about this organization that they really love, or that they didn't appreciate the services or the programs that they got to participate in or benefit from. And creating intentional feedback loops or opportunities to hear from the community so that it's not on them to like be a squeaky wheel, right? Like, no, we really do want to make these things better. And asking those questions in ways where it doesn't say like, you know, what's broken, what's not working, but really saying, you know, where could there be opportunities to have made it even better, right? So that you're not setting up that conversation or kind of forcing the solution onto the community by asking it in such a, you know, we know it's broken, because then they're not going to say this is how it's broken. The obligation then when someone hears that question is to solve it for you, which is not what you want, right? You really want to get to like, what is the problem, and having really, to use the same word again, I don't know that I fully believe it, but like safe ways for the community to be able to share that feedback and help you identify where there are places to figure out even small changes to make things better.
One thing that you know, when you're in that space of creativity and people are generating ideas, oftentimes it'll be pointing to a peer, right? So you're learning, and I think someone, I forget who, mentioned that as well, that seeing something you like and incorporating that. How do you do that well? Because I think sometimes it's easy to point to, like, Adam, I'll pick on you, but like, oh, Movember did this, like we should just do the same thing. Movember's so successful. or whoever, you could fill in the blank with a lot of great organizations. How do you learn from peers well and incorporate that into your innovative process? Jason, I don't know if you have thoughts on that one.
Yeah, I think it's in inviting some of those conversations where, sometimes, when you see some really cool stuff, I know that, just it never hurts to reach out to even ask folks to, to talk about that thing. And more often than not, I find that, people are pretty open and willing to have those conversations. And, one thing that I know was helpful even within an organization was, offering things like office hours, where it was like, yes, acknowledging, we all work together as well, but creating a dedicated space where it's like, yeah, drop in, and it's kind of like an internal, like ask me anything kind of thing, and encouraging other folks to do the same, and really to encourage that free flowing dialogue of ideas. And yeah, over time, I've found that, after reaching out to folks, having that additional conversation where like, hey, could this potentially be a recurring meeting? And, are there other people that we can also pull into the conversation on a regular basis to continue, exploring some of these concepts?
And Afua, I know, like, when you wrote The Tech That Come Next, there's a lot of great specific examples in there. Were you all thinking about the right way to present something, not to say like, oh, everyone should go do it this way, but I guess learning from the process or taking out the things relevant to your organization?
Yeah, absolutely. And in the book, we probably quote, we quote probably 36 or more people in the book, because there are so many different ways to do things, and to do things in equitable manners, in an equitable way, and in a way that helps advance the mission of your organization. So we're really intentional about that. I think, if it were easy to create technology that worked in an equitable way to execute on service and social missions, we would have done it by now. This book could have just been a one-pager of here are 10 easy things to do, and that is not the case. But there are some basic principles, and I think one of them is just really making sure that you're centering your community in the decisions that you make, that you're actually talking with the people who you claim to be serving or working with, and repeatedly, not just for a focus group at the start, but going back more and more often. You're really thinking intentionally about what technology you select, and is it something that the people who will use the technology or be affected by it actually can use and can actually engage with and can actually access. And so are you thinking about things in that way? And, again, to my point earlier, saying no sometimes as well. If the technology just isn't appropriate for the situation, even if it's free or even if it's fancy, perhaps saying no, so that you are staying true to what the people in your organization, the people who you're serving, actually need. I think that's really important as well. But yes, so while there are some general principles, and we outline some of them in the book, the specific decisions that you need to make are on your team. And I think one thing that I hope is encouraging is that you are capable of making those decisions. You can seek some input, you can seek some advice, but you being on staff or in leadership, know your organization, know the mission. And so trusting yourself to make those decisions, I think, is really important as well.
Mitch, I've been sitting with this question that you posed around sharing, and learning from each other as organizations, especially to Afua's early point in our conversation about who has the privilege to get to fail. And I think it's really complicated to say, you should talk to your peers and other organizations about what worked and what didn't work. Like, obviously you should do that. That's just like, we're all going to get better together. But there's so much risk for some people doing that other people don't have to worry about. And I just think about how many small organizations, even during the pandemic, who've said, we can't talk to anyone because if it gets back to the funder, they won't fund us. They won't think we know what we're doing. Right. We don't want it known that big technology investment we made wasn't right, or we didn't do it exactly the way we thought we would do it, because we don't want the community to think that like we don't know what we're doing, right? And so how do we, yes, I totally agree with Adam of, you know, leadership in an organization needs to build that culture and set that tone, but also like all of these other folks that are not the nonprofits need to change so that we in nonprofits have a lot more space to talk more openly about what is working, what isn't working, where we're learning, even if it has nothing to do with fail or success definitions. Like that's a false binary anyway. But just to say like, what I was today years old when I learned this thing. Did you already know it? Can I teach it to you? Right? Like we don't actually have a culture of learning if it is only within nonprofits and it doesn't include tech partners and funders and donors and everyone else around us.
Yeah, Adam, I'm curious in your experience, because I know you've said you've been in multiple cultures and organizations where you've encouraged this, like, be willing to fail and share it openly, and that's part of innovation. How have you interacted with funders around that? Like, have you found an effective way to communicate that culture and objective, or what have you found works best?
Yeah, it's that's a good question, and it's an interesting stakeholder to manage with this. You know, at Movember, you know, that was grassroots peer-to-peer funding, so it was, you know, there was no major stakeholders in that. Yeah, so but even then, like when I first got into the whole cancer research space, I was like just completely underwhelmed and frustrated with the level of duplication, competition within that sector. And so one of the things that we did there was, because Movember was global and the major funder of prostate and testicular cancer research, it was a requirement there then that if you received funding from us, that the outcomes of that research were shared, and so that people could iterate off of it. And the only thing, for the most part, that gets shared in the cancer research world is breakthroughs, and that gets written up in journals, and that fuels, you know, further funding. What doesn't get shared is the stuff that doesn't work. And charities fund basic research, which for the most part results in nothing, because if it did, it's then commercialized. So we, in that case, went back to our funding group and said, we're changing the way prostate and testicular cancer research is being done, requiring complete transparency of outcomes, because the level of duplication is in our world sort of outrageous, and we want to break that down. And that actually sort of invigorated that donor community then to go, okay, didn't know that, but that sounds obvious and it should be done. And we're in a unique position to do that, because, as I said, we were global, so we could, and the major funder of both of those cancer research categories. So if you think about it, any other cancer research group, for the most part, they're not in a position to do it. We actually took a lot of learnings of what the AIDS research community did back in, you know, the early 2000s to collaborate and come together and accelerate outcomes.
And Jason, I'd be curious, we're talking about different stakeholders here around innovation. How have you seen this work well with boards? Like, how have you seen folks manage boards well around, because I know Amy and Afua both mentioned some of those challenges of sharing failures or things you tried that didn't work. How have you seen people do that well with their boards?
Yeah, I think that for many organizations, you know, depending on the type of governance they have in place around innovation, you know, what the form that the underlying principle behind it is that, you know, you're keeping your board informed of what's going on. And so, you know, some organizations, you know, have that I've worked with have adopted kind of like committee model that is dedicated to say like innovation, if that has been made like a board mandate. And so there's like a dedicated meeting, just as you would have a meeting for, you know, finance or governance, and, you know, there would be a committee around innovation. And I think going back to the point about, you know, recognizing that the board is really there to assist along the way, and making sure that you're going in there with what are the challenges that the board can potentially help with directly, because there may be some additional guidance or connections. And I think also being open to the fact that it doesn't have to be contained within the board. So one interesting approach that I've seen too is looking at folks beyond the board for committees like that. But the underlying principle around it is just ensuring that there's regular communication to convey what's going on, and really going back to the point that was mentioned earlier, that it's not when putting some of those concerns out there, or updates, that it's not a person evaluating one thing. It's us against the problem of innovation as a whole, and recognizing that as the framework for which we're looking at the challenges.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that people don't like surprises in general, especially when you're in those settings. So the more you can make it clear what you're starting, what you're hoping to achieve, and then you're, like you said, it's then not personal. It's kind of out there, and you can both take a look at it together. That makes a lot of sense. I want to make sure, because we are rapidly running out of time in this hour, I do want to make sure we talk a bit more specifically about equity in that innovation, and not just innovating for innovation's sake, but making sure it's affecting and impacting the right people in the right way. And Afua and Amy, I'd love to hear from you quickly, just from the work you've done in the book, and now that you've gone on the road kind of talking about it. What is it that you feel like is resonating with people or surprising with people when it comes to reframing innovation, putting equity first? Afua, why don't you go first?
Yeah, so sorry, quickly lost the mute button, but I found it again. So I think one thing that we've recognized, or at least I've recognized, is that equity means different things to different people. And so when we talk about making sure things are equitable, or we talk about distributing power differently, we first have to spend some time really talking about what that means. And so in the book, we outline 6 different values to help be a little bit more clear and precise about what we mean about that. And so some of the values are around accessibility, making sure that people can access the conversations, whether it's through how you've built a site to solicit input, or whether it's through the language that you're using, or the time and place that you have meetings. Or another value that we have is really honoring expertise and lived experience. And so the ways that you've been trained, whether through formal or informal processes, or ways that you have it, and just the lived experience and how that translates to the work that you do. I think another value that we have is also around the importance of having a diversity of viewpoints and collectively creating visions for what's coming next. And so making sure that, when we say make sure everyone has a seat at the table, it's not just a seat, but a voice, and a voice that is listened to and incorporated into the vision that is being created. And so I think one of the things that I've definitely noticed is equity means different things to different people. And then 2, just recognizing that you'll need to invest some time to do this work and to do it well. And so some time in finding the right people to talk to, building relationships if you don't have them, strengthening the relationships if you do have them, building in time so that as you are designing solutions, as you're iterating on solutions or innovations that you're coming up with, that you are actually incorporating the viewpoint of your community and addressing them as well. And when you take that time at the start, then towards the end, it's a little easier, because now people have been bought in. Now people want to do the thing. Now people want to use the thing. And so that's great. But really making sure to invest the time at the start is critical if you're going to build something around equity.
I agree with everything, of course, that Afua said now and will ever say in the future. But something that I was thinking about from the way you asked that question, just in recent conversations we've had, that's stuck out to me, and that is, the name of the book is The Tech That Comes Next. And so I think folks are often expecting that Afua and I are and here's our pitch for this new mobile app. And actually our answer is often what if what we need next is not technology? And then it's sad trombones playing everywhere, jaws dropping, but I think it's important to say that, because what we're talking about in the book, and I think everyone here has talked about in this conversation, is that it isn't just technology. It is technology when we need it for a specific use case, right? And to a specific end. But, 10 years from now, if the tools that we're using to run this webinar right now are no longer the tools we need, like, I will gladly never log in again, right? Like, we don't need to have a relationship to technology that is focusing our innovation or our investments or like what we want to change and iterate on in the things we already have today, because like, heaven forbid, even those change, right? Like, that's fine. Let's change it all, right? If so long as what we are changing or using or building is in service to a more equitable world, then we don't need to hold on to any of it as like, oh, we really need to keep this around, right? But if the tools we're using today are the best aligned with what we're trying to achieve and are the most accessible to our community 10 years from now, then great. I hope we're still using them, right? But if they're not, then let's move on, and we don't need to have guilt around that change of the tools. Part of that is like the capitalist structure of most of our technology that we are paying for in one way or another, even if we don't think we're paying for it. It is maintaining that we should keep those tools, right? Because the people that are making those tools are profiting off those tools, want us to keep them. But that doesn't need to be our feeling about that technology, especially when we're trying to center our community. And what is truly most in service to supporting community needs being met is probably not some of the tools we have today.
Yeah, and you brought up how to think through the problems and making sure you're discussing with community. And Adam, you'd mentioned earlier people getting focused on their solution as opposed to really understanding the problem. I'd love to hear you just hone in a bit on like, how do you pick the best or right problem to solve or prioritize when you're having an innovation conversation?
Yeah, one problem that came to mind a few years ago was one around the distribution of our programs and where they were going. So Starlight serves every children's hospital in the country. However, the vast majority of our programs at the time were going to the wealthier, bigger hospital because they had more staff to be liaising with us. And our donors also, our major donors and our corporate partners wanted their funding to go to the big name children's hospitals because that looked better on a press release. And so that to me, like, there was a complete inequity in how we were distributing our programs. And at that point, we were just putting them up on an internal system. The hospitals would draw from them. And as I said, the richer, wealthier hospitals that serve those populations, primarily white populations, had more staff, so they would get all of our programs. So what we did then was we decided, okay, how do we make this more equitable? And so what we did, the team crunched a number of databases, so census databases, hospital databases, and then in our CRM system now for every hospital, we know the percentage of Medicare, Medicaid, percentage of white, non-white by every race. And now when we have a program, some funding come through for our gowns or our virtual reality headsets, whatever it is, we put it up on what we call a Starlight Hub, and then we prioritize medically underserved and vulnerable populations in those hospitals in those communities. And we give them first opportunity to draw on those programs. So last year, 36% of our programs went to medically underserved and vulnerable populations in the hospitals in those communities. And our commitment moving forward is 50% of all of our programs do that. And we fed that back to our major corporate donors. And they were going, okay, they understand now the tremendous impact, because a child going to those hospitals, or a family, one, they're dealing with all sorts of uncertainty around the health outcomes, financial situations, but those kids might never have had a Star Wars anything. And for them to get a hospital gown with Chewie on it or something like that, or experience virtual reality, that just changes everything for that family in that moment. So that's just an example of a problem that we had around the equitable distribution of our programs that we prioritized years ago. And it took years for us to get us to this point where we truly understand all of our hospitals in our network across the country and who they serve. And then we can go to the donors and say, right, well, we did this with Mattel last year during National Hispanic Heritage Month. They had a number of dolls and toys and books that we distributed to hospitals along the US-Mexico border. And that became a great storytelling opportunity for us and Mattel around serving those populations. So, and that drives more donors and corporate partners, because there are a lot of corporate partners that prioritize equity, full stop. So it wasn't just around a program outcome, it's translated into a fundraising and corporate partnership opportunity now as well.
Yeah, and I just want to highlight from that example both the time, as Afua mentioned, like, the stuff does take time to do it well, and there had to be a prioritization and investment in technology to be able to better understand equitable outcomes, the data culture, the systems, and so there is an investment that needs to be made there initially to make sure you're achieving the outcomes you want. In the last few minutes here, I would love to just do a quick around the horn of everyone can get their future telling hats on. And I'd love to just think, like, if we were having this conversation 5 years from now, like, what is your biggest hope for something that has changed, or where you think we're going in the next 5 years, if you can make a prediction? And Jason, I'll start off with you.
Yeah, but because I work in the education space, I think it's really the recognition that in order to have successful education outcomes, at least for the work that we do, it's really predicated on solid relationships. And so my hope for 5 years from now is that as we continue looking at the tools that are emerging, that becomes prioritized in the building of the tools themselves as a requirement. That's like, hey, how does this tool really help facilitate better relationship building, like from the very start, not to an ends of itself. It's not that, this tool will be the be all and end all, but, for organizations to, really have a say in the building of it, and really able to articulate that in very clear ways to the technology building process. So I imagine, the technology must be, fast, high bandwidth, all those things, but also, I hope that in 5 years, that one of the requirements is going to be that, it helps facilitate positive relationships, and that there's really conscious, serious thought given to it.
Awesome. Afua?
I think one of my hopes for 5 years from now is that we have more classifications from a sort of legal standpoint of how good work could be done. And so thinking about the nonprofit structure, 501c3, yes, but also what other structures could allow people to both focus on social impact and do so in a way that they can still feed their families and survive and build sustainable system and sustainable organizations.
See, I just always agree with everything Afua says. I would love 5 years from now, I know this is wishful thinking, but just accept it. I really hope 5 years from now, the conversation that we have across not just nonprofits of all different missions, but also funders and service providers and people, that we interact with, that this conversation around data has moved away from something that like nonprofits own and that funders have a right to truly self-determined, honored data for participants. It is their data, and that we've shifted into like how grateful we may be that we had any data from our participants, right? And that our data systems were prioritized as being flexible enough to honor however those participants identify themselves or set goals for their own participation in our work, right? That we are really, really changing this conversation into something that honors all of the people that are actually represented in our database,
And I agree with what Amy says.
Love that. All right, Adam, what's your final wish here before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think particularly for the not-for-profit space, at the moment there's comparability across the sector in our financials through the likes of Charity and Navigator, because we all complete a 990, and it's a simple way to grade a not-for-profit on their financial efficiency. And at Starlight, 80 cents in the dollar goes to programs. I would love in 5 years' time for there to be other indexes that are in use across the sector that compare what the 80 cents or the X cents in the dollar that goes to programs, the impact that percentage of the funding is having. And it's not there at the moment. And it's very hard to compare the impact of Starlight in our programs to Greenpeace in their programs. But we should be able to do it. And that to me is a far more important metric than going, 80 cents in the dollar goes to programs, because there's some completely inefficient programs out there. As I said, that's what we discovered when we first got into the cancer research world at Movember. So that's what I'd love. I think it might take more than 5 years, but we should be heading down that path as another way, and there could be an innovation metric as well around that.
Yeah, well, hopefully we'll make progress at least. How about that, Adam? Well, thank you so much. I know we've gone a little bit over. Appreciate everyone's time. As a reminder, this was hosted by Pond. If you are a member or want to join, you'll get $50 in your account just for letting us know what you thought. Like everyone just mentioned, data is valuable and we value it, and we want to reward you for sharing some insight with us about how you felt about the session. And we do these every Thursday, so hope to see you here next week. Thank you, everybody.